Carl Jung once wrote that empathy is not merely sensitivity, it's a form of clairvoyance, a psychological radar that penetrates the unseen motives of others. But what he rarely said publicly was this empathy, when unguarded, becomes self-erasure. The empath dissolves trying to decode everyone else's storms. Across decades of case studies, Jung noticed a pattern that terrified him. The most intuitive, emotionally intelligent individuals, those he called the soul readers, were the ones who most often lost their sense of self. They weren't insane. They were over-attuned. They could hear what others denied, feel what others buried, and carry pain that didn't belong to them. But what happens when such a person stops explaining themselves, when they withdraw from the endless duty of justification? Jung hinted at it in his private journals. He called it psychic individuation under pressure, a breaking point where the empath's nature reverses polarity. Compassion turns into clarity. Sensitivity transforms into power. Today, I'll take you inside what Jung discovered about this transformation, why empaths who stop explaining become unstoppable. For most of their lives, empaths serve as translators for other people's emotions. They smooth chaos, decode silence, absorb blame. They feel responsible for restoring balance in every room. To explain their boundaries feels cruel. To stay silent feels dishonest. So they explain, again and again, until their language becomes a leash. Jung observed this in countless patients, the urge to justify one's emotional depth as if it were a crime. He called it the tyranny of the persona, the mask that conforms to social expectations. The empath wears this mask not to deceive, but to survive. They believe understanding will earn them peace. But understanding, Jung warned, is not the same as acceptance. The empath's explanations rarely liberate them. They only educate their captors. Every apology, every justification, every "I just wanted you to understand" becomes psychic currency traded for conditional belonging. And in that trade, the empath slowly disappears. The body knows first. Tightness in the chest, fatigue after simple interactions. The nervous system begins to interpret kindness as risk, because each attempt to explain is met not with empathy, but with dismissal. Jung wrote that repression doesn't only apply to anger or desire, it applies to self-worth. To repress one's truth in the name of harmony is a form of psychic mutilation. The empath's shadow begins to grow not as cruelty, but as clarity. This is the first sign of awakening, when the empath begins to feel a quiet disgust toward their own explanations. Not hatred of others, but exhaustion with their own compliance. They begin to see how every explanation was an act of self-defense disguised as kindness. They realize that those who demand endless understanding never intended to understand in return. It's the moment empathy fractures into awareness. The soul starts to whisper, "You don't owe your truth to those who feed on your guilt." When that whisper gets loud enough, silence follows, not the silence of defeat, but the silence of reclamation. Jung noted that when the empath stops explaining, they enter the alchemical stage of withdrawal. He described it as the black sun phase, when consciousness begins to feed on its own substance rather than others' approval. The world interprets it as coldness, but internally, it's the beginning of sovereignty. They stop responding to manipulation, stop chasing closure, stop needing to be seen as good. In Jung's typology, this is the collision between the persona and the shadow. The polite, adaptive self confronts the exiled, authentic one. The empath begins to reclaim anger as energy, detachment as protection, and solitude as sacred ground. The transformation is violent not outwardly, but internally. They feel guilt for no longer overgiving, anxiety for setting limits. Yet something inside watches with a strange calm the self. Jung's term for the organizing principle of the psyche. It knows that every revolution begins with withdrawal. The empath's silence is not emptiness. It's a recalibration of energy. When they stop explaining, they stop leaking psychic power. And what returns is astonishing focus, intuition, authority. Their perception sharpens from diffuse compassion to laser clarity. People who once relied on their emotional labor begin to panic. You've changed. You're distant. You're selfish. The empath hears these words like echoes from an old script and does not respond. Because for the first time, they see the transaction beneath the affection. This is the forbidden truth Jung left buried in his notes. Empathy without boundaries becomes possession. The empath, in trying to heal others, becomes inhabited by their pain. Jung called it psychic contagion. The cure was not less empathy, but more individuation. To separate what is mine from what is theirs. To stop explaining and start observing. It's a shift from fusion to awareness, from rescuing to witnessing, from reaction to choice. When you felt that quiet rage before awakening, you know this moment. The breaking point where you no longer defend your perception. You stop negotiating with people committed to misunderstanding you. That's the first taste of freedom. And it's terrifying, because the world punishes those who no longer explain. Jung documented what happened next, the phase he called psychic reorganization. When the empath withdraws, the external world begins to crumble. Relationships shift. Loyalties dissolve. The emotional gravity of their old life reverses. What once felt like connection now feels like captivity. He wrote, "The individual who ceases to explain awakens the anxiety of others." For communication was never about truth, it was about control. Those who once depended on the empath's constant justification experience withdrawal like an addiction. The empath's silence mirrors them back to themselves, and most people cannot bear their own reflection. That is when the accusations begin. You're cold. You're arrogant. You've lost compassion. But Jung's field notes are clear. What they've lost is servitude. What they've gained is psychic coherence. In his Zurich clinic, Jung described a recurring moment in his patients, a look of quiet terror followed by relief. It was when they realized their empathy had been trained by trauma. Their childhoods had conditioned them to scan for danger, decode emotions, and anticipate needs before anyone asked. What they called intuition was once survival. Jung called this the archetype of the wounded healer. Those who once needed to understand in order to stay safe grow into adults who cannot stop understanding, even when it hurts them. Their empathy is both a gift and a scar. And when they stop explaining, that survival program collapses. The body interprets it as death, but the psyche, the deeper intelligence, interprets it as birth. Across multiple cases, Jung observed the same transformation. The empath's nervous system rebalances. They stop reacting to every emotional vibration. Their dreams become vivid, symbolic, and unsettling. Images of fire, mirrors, empty rooms. The unconscious begins to cleanse itself. In alchemical terms, this was calcination, the burning away of the false self. He warned one must endure the inner fire without extinguishing it, because the empath's silence often summons every shadow they've ever avoided. Anger, resentment, abandonment. The emotions they suppressed while keeping peace now demand recognition. This confrontation with the shadow is the crucible of power. The empath learns that anger is not cruelty, it's information. It tells them when boundaries have been crossed. Guilt becomes a map of old conditioning. Fear becomes a signal of misalignment. They begin to speak less, but perceive more. They move slower, but act with precision. They no longer explain their decisions because they no longer seek permission. Jung wrote that the individuated empath becomes a living contradiction, sensitive yet untouchable. Their emotions remain profound, but they no longer identify with them. They observe, analyze, choose. The transformation terrifies others because it exposes an uncomfortable fact. Empathy without self-awareness is manipulation in reverse. It makes the empath controllable through guilt. But once awareness enters, the system breaks. The empath stops being an emotional mirror and becomes a lens. They don't reflect people anymore, they reveal them. At this stage, Jung noted a shift in language. The patient who once said, "I feel everything," begins to say, "I notice everything." Feeling turns into observation. Compassion turns into discernment. And with that linguistic shift, the empath's energy field, their psychological boundaries reorganize. They no longer absorb others' projections. They see them. Jung described projection as the unconscious exportation of one's shadow onto another. When an empath stops explaining, they stop participating in this unconscious trade. The other person's unresolved shame has nowhere to land. It ricochets back, forcing confrontation. That's why silence feels like violence to the manipulator. It denies them the supply of emotional validation. What terrified Jung wasn't the breakdown, it was what emerged afterward. Once the empath stops explaining, they begin to perceive patterns most people are blind to: tone, motive, contradiction, micro-expression. Not to judge, but to decode reality as it is, not as it's presented. Their intuition becomes forensic. He compared it to X-ray vision of the psyche, the ability to see the skeleton beneath the persona. This is why such people are often accused of reading too much into things, because they do, and they're right. But now, they no longer use that insight to fix anyone. They use it to protect their equilibrium. Jung's journals describe the next phase as return of psychic energy to the self. He noticed that once the empath ceased endless explanation, their vitality returned. Physical symptoms eased. Their creativity expanded. The psyche began to invest its resources inward instead of leaking outward. Dreams of flight replaced dreams of drowning. In one entry, Jung wrote, "The reclaimed empath is the prototype of conscious humanity, because their sensitivity, once purified of guilt, becomes wisdom. They stop being defined by how deeply they feel, and start being defined by how clearly they see." The transformation isn't loud. It's surgical. They begin cutting emotional cords not out of anger, but necessity. Silence becomes their boundary. Distance becomes their therapy. And the most radical act of empathy they perform is toward themselves. When that moment of clarity finally hits, there's no going back. They can't re-enter small talk with people who thrive on chaos. They can't explain intuition to those who worship logic. They can't shrink again for comfort. This is the cost of awareness irreversibility. Some people call it awakening. Others just type, "I see it now." Jung concluded that the empath's ultimate transformation was not becoming less emotional, but more conscious. They didn't lose sensitivity, they gained sovereignty. He saw this as a microcosm of human evolution, the transition from unconscious empathy to conscious awareness, from emotional reaction to psychological mastery. And yet, he warned, this stage isolates the individual, because society rewards compliance, not consciousness. When you stop explaining, you stop belonging to the tribe of the unaware. But you begin belonging to yourself. What comes after silence is not peace, it's precision. Jung described it as the crystallization of the self. The empath, once porous and fragmented, becomes a single, integrated structure. Every disowned emotion, the anger they feared, the ambition they suppressed, the intuition they doubted returns home. This is individuation in its purest form, the unification of the conscious and the unconscious. The empath is no longer at war with their nature. They no longer need to explain their depth because they embody it. Their energy no longer scatters across emotional landscapes. It focuses. And focus is what society mistakes for coldness. In this integrated state, empathy becomes strategy, not sacrifice. They see others' wounds clearly, but they no longer confuse recognition with responsibility. Jung noted that the individuated empath develops functional detachment, the ability to understand suffering without drowning in it. It's not indifference, it's clarity. They can stand in front of manipulation and feel nothing stir. The old triggers guilt, shame, obligation dissolve, not because they've become heartless, but because they've become whole. The relationships around them transform too. People who fed on explanations drift away. Conversations lose their drama. Friendships either evolve or expire. Jung said this is inevitable. The integrated individual alters the psychic field of every system they inhabit. Their stability disrupts codependence. Their silence reveals dysfunction. To those who still operate from unconscious patterns, the awakened empath becomes unbearable, a mirror that reflects too clearly. And yet, to those who are ready to grow, that same empath becomes magnetic. Their calm has gravity. Their words, few but surgical, carry the weight of truth. Jung once observed that real healing begins when the individual can stand alone, when they no longer require understanding to validate experience. That's the paradox. When the empath stops explaining, they finally communicate. Their presence itself becomes language. Their silence becomes instruction. Their boundaries become law. No raised voice, no long defense, no emotional justification, just clarity, embodied. This, Jung wrote, is the return to the center. For years, the empath's consciousness orbited others' emotions like a satellite. Now the gravity inverts. They become the sun. Others either align or burn out trying. The empath, who once felt cursed by perception, becomes a force of orientation. They can walk into chaos and remain unshaken, not because the world softened, but because they did not internalize it anymore. They are no longer in emotion. They are with it, observing, learning, choosing. Jung's final reflections on such transformations were eerily prophetic. He wrote, "The future of humanity depends on individuals who can feel deeply without becoming enslaved by feeling." He believed this type of consciousness, empathic yet autonomous, represented the next stage of psychological evolution, the balance between intuition and intellect, compassion and boundary. He called it the emergence of the conscious empath, a human capable of loving without losing themselves. Empaths who stop explaining become unstoppable because they no longer seek external validation to confirm internal truth. Their energy, once diffused through justification, becomes directed toward creation. They build, write, teach, lead. Their insight, once weaponized against themselves, becomes medicine for others. When they speak now, people listen because every word carries the frequency of self-possession. They don't try to convince, they simply are. In Jung's private letters, he confessed that the most evolved souls he encountered weren't saints or scholars, but those who had learned to be misunderstood and remain calm, because misunderstanding is the tax of authenticity. To stop explaining is to trust your inner authority. It's to say, my truth doesn't require agreement. And that's the point where empathy matures into wisdom. They no longer read emotions to survive, they read them to guide. Their empathy becomes a compass pointing toward integrity. They've transcended reaction. They've entered response. At this final stage, Jung saw the empath as an archetype of integration, the bridge between feeling and knowing. They embody what he called the self-realized soul, one who can sit in another's pain without drowning, witness deceit without collapsing, love without losing shape. Their power no longer depends on pleasing or persuading. It emanates from understanding the unconscious motives that drive both themselves and others and choosing differently. That is true psychological freedom, the ability to choose consciousness in a world addicted to projection. So when the empath stops explaining, they don't disappear, they evolve. They move from healer to mirror, from rescuer to revealer, from victim of sensitivity to master of perception. And the world, still asleep in its noise, won't understand this evolution. It will call it detachment, arrogance, or isolation. But the awakened empath knows this is what freedom feels like. They have outgrown the need to be understood because they finally understand themselves. And if this awakening speaks to you, type in the comments, "I protect my peace with clarity." Your transformation serves not just your healing, but humanity's evolution. Each time one empath refuses to explain, the collective unconscious moves one step closer to awareness. You are not abandoning compassion, you are refining it. You are not turning cold, you are becoming crystalline. You are not giving up, you are waking up. Thanks for watching. See you in the next dimension. Beneath the surface of ordinary life, there are individuals who carry within them an unexplainable sensitivity, a gift so luminous it feels almost dangerous to the world around them. They are the ones who can walk into a room and feel what no one dares to say aloud, who notice the tremor in another's voice or the sadness tucked behind a smile. Their empathy is not an act of kindness they choose, it is an inevitability, an unfiltered connection to the unseen emotional currents moving through others. And yet, as Carl Jung discovered, this radiant capacity for connection often becomes the very reason they suffer most. It is as though their light, instead of being welcomed, becomes a mirror in which others are forced to confront the shadows they cannot bear to see. Jung once described how the unconscious hides not only our darkest impulses, but also the vitality we once abandoned in order to survive. For many people, the persona, that carefully constructed mask worn to fit societal expectations, becomes a prison. They trade authenticity for acceptance, burying vulnerability beneath layers of performance. But when such a person encounters someone who has kept their feeling function alive, someone whose sensitivity has not yet been sacrificed, the encounter is shattering. It is as if the empath's presence whispers, "This is what you have lost. This is what you no longer dare to feel." And for many, that confrontation is unbearable. Instead of gratitude, it sparks resentment. Sparks. The empath is often sought out, initially, as if they carry a secret medicine. Strangers confide in them within minutes. Friends describe them as safe harbors in the storm. Lovers cling to them, intoxicated by the freedom of being seen without judgment. And yet, as Jung noted, this intimacy almost always curdles with time. Those who once leaned on their empathy begin to criticize, to mock, to accuse them of being too much, too intense, or too emotional. It is not the empath they despise. It is the reflection of their own disowned soul that feels intolerable. The empath becomes both healer and scapegoat, a paradoxical figure who magnetizes others' wounds and then suffers for daring to hold them. In Jung's language, this is shadow projection. The shadow is everything in ourselves we cannot accept, everything repressed, denied, or unloved. And when it rises in the presence of an empath, it does not announce itself as shadow. It disguises itself as criticism, distance, hostility. You are too sensitive. You are naive. You need to toughen up. These words are not born of wisdom. They are born of the pain of those who severed their connection to authentic feeling long ago, who now punish in others what they once were forced to kill in themselves. Jung saw this pattern repeatedly. The empath punished not for their flaws, but for their wholeness. Their innocence is seen as weakness, their openness as foolishness, their sensitivity as fragility. And yet, beneath every accusation lies a deeper truth. The accuser is grieving the loss of their own light. The tragedy is that many empaths internalize this projection. They begin to doubt the very qualities that make them most alive. Slowly, they dim their brightness to avoid provoking resentment. They harden their hearts to appear strong. They contort themselves into the same false personas that suffocate the rest of the world. Jung called this the dimming epidemic, the slow erosion of authenticity under the weight of collective shadow. It is not just an individual tragedy, but a collective one. For when empaths abandon themselves, humanity loses its pioneers, its reminders that emotional aliveness is still possible in a disconnected world. But what makes this dynamic even more cruel is its paradoxical pull. The same people who resent an empath's sensitivity are drawn to it like moths to flame. Something in the unconscious recognizes what has been lost, longs for it, aches for it. That is why people confess their secrets in the presence of such individuals, why they feel relief in their company. For a moment, the empath awakens what was buried. But instead of integration, most flee from the discomfort of that awakening. They lash out, not knowing why, desperate to silence the mirror. The empath becomes both beloved and despised, sought after and rejected, a living paradox that carries the unbearable weight of others' unhealed wounds. And yet, Jung insisted, this pattern is not fate. It can destroy, but it can also transform. The empath who learns to recognize projection for what it is begins to see the resentment they face not as truth about their nature, but as revelation about others' wounds. They stop asking, "What is wrong with me?" and begin to wonder, "What does my light reveal in others that they cannot yet face?" This shift marks the beginning of individuation, the journey toward wholeness. For Jung, individuation is not about becoming perfect. It is about integrating shadow and light, persona and truth, and standing in the fullness of one's self without collapsing under the judgments of others. Imagine, for a moment, the empath standing in a storm of criticism. Once, those words might have pierced their heart, convincing them to betray their own sensitivity. But now, through awareness, those same words become signposts. Too sensitive. Someone says, and the empath realizes, this is not about them. It is about a person who once had to bury their own sensitivity in order to survive. Naive. Another sneers, and the empath recognizes the bitterness of someone who armored themselves with cynicism. Each attack becomes less of a wound and more of a window, less a condemnation and more a confession. This is what Jung called projection immunity, the capacity to stand in one's truth without absorbing the shadows of others as one's own. But such immunity is not coldness. It is not detachment. It is the opposite, a deeper compassion. For once the empath understands that the hostility directed toward them is not malice but unconscious grief. They can hold their ground without hatred. They can protect their authenticity without vengeance. They can shine without apology, knowing that some will flee from the light, others will resent it, and a rare few will be ready to walk into its warmth. And it is for those few, those ready to reclaim their own emotional aliveness, that the empath's gift exists. In this way, the empath's suffering is not meaningless. It is initiation. Every betrayal, every criticism, every abandonment becomes part of a deeper calling. For in surviving this paradox, in refusing to dim their light, empaths become the very guides Jung believed essential for humanity's evolution. They prove that sensitivity is not weakness, but a form of strength the modern world has forgotten. They become, in Jung's words, living symbols of the self whole, authentic, radiant, integrated. And though the journey wounds them, it also shapes them into mirrors not just of others' shadows, but of what is possible when the shadow is faced with courage. They move through this world carrying a strange burden, the ability to feel what others suppress, to sense what most have buried. For the empath, this is not a chosen vocation. It is their nature, a sensitivity written into their very being. Jung saw these individuals as both blessed and cursed, for they live with a luminous authenticity that others both crave and cannot endure. Their presence disrupts the fragile equilibrium of those who depend on masks, exposing cracks in the persona where the shadow leaks through. What appears as hostility toward the empath is, in truth, a silent war between someone's outer adaptation and their inner truth. Consider how the persona works. It is the face one shows to the world, polished to earn approval, curated to avoid rejection. It is necessary, even protective. But it is not the whole truth. Beneath it lies the shadow, those impulses, desires, and vulnerabilities society deemed unacceptable, buried away in shame. For many, the shadow grows heavy with everything genuine that could not find a place in the persona. And when they meet an empath, whose presence carries a natural openness and refusal to fully betray the inner life, the buried returns, not gently, but with violence. The empath becomes the screen onto which all this disowned content is projected. What one cannot bear to face within is easier to accuse another of embodying. Jung's insight was clear: we attack in others what we fear in ourselves. The empath's light does not cause resentment, it awakens it. Their compassion ignites unconscious grief. Their vulnerability stirs buried shame. Their authenticity threatens the fragile scaffolding of false identities. It is not uncommon for those drawn to empaths to oscillate wildly, gratitude followed by resentment, intimacy followed by withdrawal, admiration followed by attack. The empath, bewildered, feels betrayed without knowing why. They cannot understand how offering love, understanding, and presence could invite cruelty. But Jung saw that this was never about the empath's actions. It was about what their being awakened in another's unconscious. In clinical practice, Jung described cases where empaths became lightning rods for projection. Patients would confess everything to them, marvel at their understanding, then slowly begin to undermine them, sometimes subtly, with sarcastic comments or small criticisms, other times openly, with accusations and rejection. It is as if the unconscious, threatened by exposure, must strike back to preserve its defenses. Jung noted how predictable this pattern became. The empath would be adored, then attacked, their light first sought, then despised. The cycle repeated, leaving sensitive individuals devastated, doubting themselves, questioning their worth. And here lies the danger. The empath, subjected to these projections again and again, often turns the weapon inward. Instead of recognizing the projection as belonging to the other, they absorb it as truth about themselves. They begin to believe they are indeed too much, too emotional, too fragile. What was once a natural gift becomes a wound they seek to cauterize. They shut down their openness, mute their sensitivity, don the very persona they once illuminated in others. Jung warned that this self-betrayal is far more tragic than the attacks themselves. For when the empath denies their authenticity, they not only lose themselves, humanity loses its most vital torchbearers of emotional aliveness. But if the empath can endure, if they can recognize the pattern for what it is, transformation begins. To see projection clearly is to no longer be enslaved by it. The empath learns that resentment directed toward them is not evidence of their flaw, but testimony to another's wound. They begin to interpret attacks not as revelations of who they are, but of who the other has abandoned. This awareness marks a turning point. The empath ceases to be a victim of unconscious hostility and becomes a conscious witness to it. In this witnessing, there is freedom. Yet awareness alone is not enough. Jung spoke often of the necessity of boundaries not as walls of withdrawal, but as permeable membranes that protect without hardening. For empaths, this means distinguishing between authentic connection and unconscious exploitation. It means knowing when their presence serves another's growth, and when it merely becomes a vessel for projection. The empath must learn to say, "I will not dim my light to make you comfortable, but I will not allow your shadow to define me either." This is not cruelty, but discernment. It is what Jung called individuation in relationship, the ability to remain whole without collapsing into another's unconsciousness. And here's the paradox: when the empath holds their light without shame, without apology, they often become the catalyst for true healing in others. Not all will flee, not all will resent. Some, confronted with their shadow in the presence of authentic empathy, will find the courage to reclaim what they lost. They will recognize that what they envied was never a threat but an invitation. In these rare instances, the empath becomes not only a mirror but a midwife, helping another birth their buried authenticity back into life. Still, the path is dangerous. For every person who accepts the mirror, there are many who resist it violently. Jung warned that empaths cannot offer themselves indiscriminately. They must learn to discern who is ready for their presence and who is not. To give endlessly, without this discernment, is to invite endless wounding, but to withhold entirely is to betray the gift. The art lies in balance, to serve where one's light can be received, and to withdraw where it will only be resented. This is not selfishness, it is sacred stewardship. If you, listening now, have felt the sting of being punished for your sensitivity, know that this pain does not prove your brokenness, it proves your light. Those who mock or resent your empathy are not exposing your weakness, but revealing their grief. They resent not you, but their own lost ability to feel. Your authenticity is not too much. It is exactly what this fractured world desperately needs. And yet, it must be protected, not squandered. You are not here to convince the numb to feel. You are here to embody feeling so fully that those who are ready may remember themselves through you. Jung once wrote that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. For the empath, that privilege is also a responsibility. To remain authentic in a world that often despises authenticity is an act of quiet revolution. To feel deeply in a culture that rewards numbness is to carry a flame others may not yet be able to bear. But do not mistake their discomfort for your flaw. The flame must not be extinguished. It must be guarded, tended, and offered wisely, for it is through such light that the collective shadow begins, however slowly, to dissolve. There comes a moment in every empath's life when the pain of misunderstanding weighs heavier than the gift itself. They begin to wonder if their sensitivity is a curse, if the accusations that they are too much might be true. They look back over patterns of friendship, love, and family, and notice the same recurring theme: the initial closeness. The trust poured into their open hands, followed by the sudden shift: criticism, withdrawal, betrayal. And in that repetition, despair often takes root. Jung recognized this despair as the most dangerous threshold an empath must cross, for it is here that many choose to extinguish their light entirely. What once made them extraordinary becomes something they feel compelled to hide. They begin performing emotional death in order to survive in a world too numb to recognize what it has lost. But hidden within this despair lies the seed of transformation. Jung understood suffering not as a punishment, but as an initiation. The empath's wound is not meaningless. It is the very doorway into individuation, into becoming fully themselves. For only by encountering the betrayal of their gift can they learn the deeper truth: their empathy is not meant to save everyone. It is not meant to be consumed by those who fear it. It is meant to be lived, protected, and shared with discernment. The empath's challenge is not to dim their sensitivity, but to learn how to carry it without being destroyed by others' projections. This is a path of fire, one that burns away illusions until only the essence remains. Jung documented how empaths often fall into what he called the mirror trap. They reflect the buried truth of others so clearly that they become entangled in the hostility that follows. In this trap, The empath begins to mistake others' resentment as evidence of their own unworthiness. Yet Jung insisted that the mirror is not the one to blame for what it reveals. The hatred poured upon them belongs to those who see in their reflection the ghost of a self long abandoned. The empath is not the cause of their pain, they are simply the reminder. To step out of this trap requires a shift in perception. Instead of asking, "Why does everyone turn against me?" the empath begins to ask, "What does my presence awaken in others that they cannot yet hold?" With this shift, every criticism becomes information, every betrayal a revelation of another's inner exile. What once felt like personal failure transforms into evidence of the empath's potency. Their sensitivity is no longer a liability but a mirror of immense power, one that can terrify as much as it heals. Yet such awareness does not erase the loneliness of the path. Jung knew that empaths, if isolated, risk collapse under the weight of constant projection. They need sanctuary, not in hiding, but in communion with those who can recognize and protect authenticity. He described the necessity of finding one's tribe fellow empaths who mirror back not the shadow, but the light. Emotionally evolved individuals who may not share the gift but honor it, and conscious allies who, though not naturally empathic, choose to protect and appreciate sensitivity. In the presence of such people, the empath remembers that they are not too much, they are exactly enough. These relationships become oases in the desert, places where the flame is not attacked but celebrated. And still, even with sanctuary, the empath must face the inner danger of self-betrayal. Jung wrote of the authenticity erosion, the slow surrender of one's true feeling function in exchange for social acceptance. This erosion happens subtly, a laugh swallowed here, a tear held back there, a truth silenced to avoid conflict. Over time, the empath begins to resemble the very numbness they once awakened others from. This is perhaps the greatest tragedy: the empath who forgets themselves, who becomes another mask among masks. Jung called this the epidemic of dimming, a silent plague where sensitivity is buried not by external force, but by internal surrender. The path forward demands courage, not the courage of conquest, but the courage of authenticity, to feel deeply in a world that rewards detachment, to remain open in a culture that teaches cynicism, to speak truth even when it trembles in the throat. Jung believed that such courage was not optional but essential, for empaths are not simply individuals with a gift, they are carriers of humanity's future. Their aliveness reveals what the collective has forgotten, that to be human is not to be invulnerable, but to be profoundly touched by life. Every tear, every tremor, every pulse of compassion is evidence of that aliveness. And it is this aliveness that the world secretly longs for, even as it resents it. The paradox deepens, for while the empath's gift is medicine, it cannot be forced upon those who are not ready to receive it. To pour empathy into closed hands is to waste it. To force compassion upon the armored is to wound oneself. Jung emphasized that empaths must learn selective engagement, the wisdom to know where their gifts will nourish and where they will be trampled. This is not withdrawal, but precision. It is the art of giving from overflow, not depletion. It is the recognition that their light must be offered as a choice, not imposed as a cure. And so, the empath stands at a crossroads. On one side, the path of collapse dimming, self-betrayal, and assimilation into the numbness of the collective. On the other, the path of integration, recognition, boundary, community, and service. Jung believed that those who choose the latter become something rare, living beacons of authenticity. They no longer apologize for their sensitivity. They no longer collapse under resentment. They embody a luminous presence that says to the world, yes, feeling is dangerous, but it is the only way to be truly alive. If you are listening and recognize yourself in these words, know this: your suffering has meaning. The betrayals you have endured are not signs of weakness, but evidence of the mirror you carry. You are not resented because you are flawed. You are resented because you remind others of their own abandoned truth. And though this path is lonely, it is also holy. For in refusing to extinguish your sensitivity, you hold open the possibility of a world that feels again. You are not here to be swallowed by projection. You are here to become a living testament to what it means to remain human in a world that has forgotten. There is a strange silence that follows the empath when they begin to awaken to this truth. A silence not of emptiness, but of clarity. The noise of other people's projections, once deafening, begins to separate from their own inner voice. What once felt like personal accusation now reveals itself as borrowed grief. And in that silence, something new stirs the first glimpse of the self. The archetype Jung described as the totality of the psyche, the wholeness that holds both shadow and light. For the empath, touching the self is not an abstract idea. It is a lived necessity. Without this deeper anchor, they remain vulnerable to the endless tides of other people's unprocessed pain. The self whispers what the world denies: you are not too much. You are the measure of what is missing. This recognition does not come as triumph, but as a quiet, steadying presence. It is the moment an empath realizes that their authenticity is not a flaw to be corrected, but a force to be embodied. And yet, with that recognition comes responsibility. For if they do not learn to hold their gift wisely, it will consume them. Jung emphasized that individuation is not simply the discovery of the true self, but the integration of it into life, the weaving of authenticity into the fabric of daily existence. To live as an empath means to carry light into places where it may be resented, and to do so without collapsing into bitterness. Still, the temptations remain. Jung documented the pitfalls empaths often fall into once they begin to see the dynamics clearly. Some, filled with righteous anger, turn their insight into a weapon. They recognize projection in others and begin to hurl it back with contempt. But this only deepens the cycle, transforming the empath into the very persecutor they once suffered under. Others, intoxicated by their sensitivity, slip into a quiet arrogance, mistaking their gift as proof of superiority. But superiority severs connection, making empathy hollow, and still others retreat entirely, justifying isolation as protection, cutting themselves off from both danger and belonging. Jung saw these paths as distortions of the gift, false refuges that ultimately betray the light they sought to preserve. The true integration is subtler. It asks the empath to remain vulnerable while also discerning, open, yet not porous to every projection. It is what Jung called selective permeability, the ability to let in what nourishes while deflecting what destroys. This is not the numbness of walls, but the living intelligence of boundaries. The empath learns to sense when another's words come from authenticity and when they come from shadow. They learn to pause before absorbing, to ask within, does this belong to me, or does it belong to them? And with practice, they discover that much of what once pierced their heart was never theirs to carry. At this stage, relationships transform. No longer do they seek acceptance from those who cannot give it. No longer do they twist themselves to fit into the numbness of others. Instead, they begin to notice the signals of genuine connection, the eyes that light with curiosity rather than judgment, the voices that welcome their sensitivity rather than mock it, the presence that protects rather than drains. These become their true companions, their tribe, and in these bonds, the empath's gift is not a burden, but a celebration. They discover that authenticity can be met with authenticity, that feeling deeply does not always end in betrayal. For the first time, They feel what it means to be at home. And yet, even here, Jung reminded, the empath's work is not only personal, for their gift does not belong to them alone. It belongs to the collective. Humanity evolves not only through intellect and achievement, but through emotional expansion, through the reclaiming of what has been buried in shadow. Empaths, when integrated, become bridges for this evolution. They model what it means to live with heart unarmored yet protected, with sensitivity intact yet empowered. They show others that the path back to feeling is not only possible, but necessary. But this service must come without sacrifice. Too often, empaths burn themselves out in their desire to heal, giving beyond their capacity until nothing remains. Jung saw this as another form of betrayal, for the world gains nothing from an extinguished flame. True service, he taught, comes from overflow, not depletion. The integrated empath does not bleed themselves dry for those unwilling to heal. They radiate their light steadily, offering it to those who are ready, while refusing to dim it for those who are not. This is authentic service, a giving that does not destroy the giver, a compassion that flows without erasing the self. Imagine an empath standing in a crowded room. Once, they would have absorbed every undercurrent, every hidden tension, until exhaustion hollowed them out. But now, with integration, they move differently. They feel the energies, but they discern. They sense the projections, but they do not take them in. They hear the criticism, but they recognize it as shadow speech, not truth. And in the midst of it all, they remain steady, luminous, whole. Some will resent them still, some will mock, but others, touched by their presence, will quietly awaken to their own buried truth. This is the empath's silent revolution, not to fight the world's numbness, but to embody aliveness so fully that others remember their own. If you are hearing these words and feel the ache of recognition, know this: your path is not about becoming invulnerable. It is about becoming true. The shadows cast upon you are not proof of your weakness, but evidence of your mirror. You are not here to absorb everyone's pain. You are here to embody your own wholeness, and in doing so, to remind the world that feeling is not a defect, it is the very essence of being human. The light you carry is not fragile. It only feels fragile when you mistake it for something that must be hidden. In truth, it grows stronger the more you dare to live it openly, unapologetically, with discernment and compassion intertwined. And so the empath's journey is not toward escape, but toward deeper embodiment, not toward hardening, but toward luminous strength. Jung understood that the world will always wrestle with its shadows, but he also believed that empaths, when they protect their authenticity, become the very catalysts of humanity's awakening. They do not need to save everyone. They only need to remain whole, and in doing so, they keep alive the possibility of a world that feels again. The deeper one journeys into this paradox, the clearer it becomes that the empath is not merely a fragile vessel tossed by the storms of others' unconsciousness, but a crucible, a place where the fire of human contradiction burns until something new can be born. Jung saw this not only in his patients, but in his own life, the way authentic perception can threaten the foundations of every false identity it encounters. To see truth clearly is to destabilize every lie built to survive its absence. That is why empaths are simultaneously sought out and resented, because their presence destabilizes the delicate balance of repression. The world wants their light, but not the heat that accompanies it. When someone burdened by unprocessed shadow meets an empath, the experience is both magnetic and unbearable. For a fleeting moment, they feel alive again. They sense that the numbness that has hardened around their heart is not inevitable. The empath's openness acts as a mirror in which their own lost vitality flickers faintly. But such recognition carries pain, the pain of realizing how much of themselves has been sacrificed to survive. And rather than face that grief, they project it outward. They accuse the empath of being too emotional, too naive, too vulnerable. In truth, what they despise is the evidence of their own exile. The empath embodies what they abandoned, and to acknowledge it would be to confront unbearable loss. This is what Jung called the innocence-punishment dynamic. Those who have lost their emotional innocence, whether through trauma, neglect, or cultural conditioning, often cannot tolerate being near those who have preserved theirs. They punish in others what was taken from them. They mock vulnerability as weakness because vulnerability once exposed them to pain. They scorn trust because their own was betrayed. They despise sensitivity because sensitivity once meant danger. And so they turn against the empath, not out of malice, but out of unconscious self-preservation. The tragedy is that the empath, who only wanted to offer love, becomes the target of wounds they did not inflict. And yet, within this paradox lies the empath's greatest potential. For when they understand that the resentment they encounter is not personal, but archetypal, they stop collapsing under it. They begin to see themselves not as broken, but as necessary. Their role is not to be universally accepted, but to embody what humanity has forgotten. They are reminders of the possibility of aliveness in a world addicted to numbness. They are guardians of the feeling function, carriers of the flame that others lost along the way. And though this role is lonely, it is not meaningless. In fact, Jung believed it was essential for humanity's evolution. But carrying this role requires transformation. The empath must move beyond unconscious absorption into conscious presence. They must learn to see the projections directed at them not as wounds to absorb, but as signals to interpret. This anger reveals a grief. This criticism reveals a fear. This rejection reveals a buried longing. Each interaction becomes less about survival and more about insight. In this way, what once crushed them becomes a source of wisdom. They stop being mere sponges for pain and become interpreters of the unconscious, reading the hidden language beneath hostility. This is where their gift matures no longer reactive, but revelatory. Still, there is a cost. For every empath who survives this transformation, there are countless others who are consumed by the pattern. Some collapse into despair, dimming their light until they disappear into the grayness of conformity. Others harden, abandoning their empathy altogether, becoming cynical in order to protect themselves. Jung saw in these tragedies the evidence of how fragile yet necessary the empathic gift is when it is lost. Humanity loses not only individuals, but a pathway back to its own soul. For without empaths, the collective shadow grows unchecked, unchallenged, unmirrored. Yet history shows what is possible when the gift is preserved. Jung studied figures like St. Francis of Assisi, who maintained radical empathy despite relentless criticism. Francis embodied compassion so vividly that even when mocked for his softness, he refused to abandon his sensitivity. His life became proof that authenticity, when protected, can outlast hostility. On the other hand, figures like Vincent van Gogh revealed the devastation of an unprotected empathic gift. His sensitivity birthed genius, but without the boundaries to shield him from resentment, he turned the hostility inward. His tragedy was not his sensitivity, but his inability to hold it as sacred. His despair came not from his gift itself, but from believing that others' rejection proved he was wrong to have it. Jung himself wrestled with this same paradox. His insights into the unconscious threatened colleagues who preferred the safety of intellectual systems over the danger of emotional truth. He too had to choose dim his perception for acceptance, or remain authentic and risk isolation. His choice to protect his gift, even when misunderstood, became the foundation of his life's work. In this, Jung modeled for empaths the path of integration, not retreating from the world, not collapsing under its hostility, but holding one's truth steadily enough that others might eventually learn to bear it. For the empath listening now, this is the call to recognize that your sensitivity is not a mistake, but a mirror of possibility. The pain you have endured is not evidence that you are flawed, but that you carry what others have lost. Your suffering is the cost of holding a flame in a world that has learned to live in darkness. But if you can protect that flame, if you can carry it without apology, you become more than a victim of projection. You become a living reminder of what it means to be whole. Jung wrote that the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. For empaths, this acceptance is not only terrifying, it is revolutionary. It means daring to believe that your feeling nature is not too much, but exactly enough. The world may continue to resent you, some will criticize, some will flee, some will punish, but there will also be those who, seeing your authenticity, will remember their own. To them, your presence will not be unbearable, but liberating. You will not save them. They must do their own work, but you will remind them that feeling is not weakness, that sensitivity is not fragility, that authenticity is not foolishness. You will remind them that being human means being touched, deeply, by life. And in this reminder, you serve not only yourself, but the whole of humanity. At a certain point, the empath who has endured betrayal after betrayal begins to sense a deeper current beneath their suffering. They notice that each rejection, each criticism, each punishment for being too much is not random but patterned. And in that recognition, a shift occurs. What once felt like chaos begins to reveal structure. The empath realizes they are not simply unlucky in love, in friendship, in family. They are playing out an archetypal drama, one that Jung saw repeating in countless lives. To see this is both sobering and liberating. Sobering, because it reveals the scale of the challenge. Liberating, because it means the pain has meaning, and meaning can transform despair into purpose. Jung wrote that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. For empaths, the unconscious manifests as projection, the shadow of others seeking a host. And until they recognize this, they remain trapped, mistaking hostility for truth and turning resentment into self-doubt. But when they begin to see projection for what it is, fate loosens its grip. They stop believing every accusation. They stop apologizing for their nature. They stop contorting themselves to fit the emotional limitations of others. Instead, they begin to live with clarity. This is mine, and this is not. This separation is not indifference. It is sovereignty. It is the beginning of psychological freedom. But sovereignty does not mean isolation. Jung warned of the danger of withdrawing entirely, of mistaking solitude for safety. The empath's gift is relational by nature. It is not meant to wither in hiding. The task is not to escape humanity, but to engage it wisely. That is why Jung spoke of the necessity of discernment, knowing where to give and where to withhold. Empathy poured into the armored heart will only return as resentment. But empathy shared with those who can receive it becomes nourishment, even medicine. The integrated empath learns to give where there is resonance, and to protect themselves where there is only projection. This is not rejection of others. It is alignment with reality. And here the empath encounters another paradox. By refusing to seek universal acceptance, they discover authentic connection. When they stop trying to win over those who resent them, they create space for those who celebrate them. When they stop dimming their light to comfort others, they attract those who long for that very brightness. Jung emphasized that individuation requires this shift, moving from the hunger for belonging at any cost to the courage of authentic relatedness. It is better to be truly seen by a few than superficially accepted by many. For in those few relationships, the empath finds sanctuary, not performance. And in that sanctuary, they grow stronger, steadier, more whole. As this integration deepens, the empath begins to embody what Jung called the self, the center that reconciles opposites. They no longer see sensitivity as weakness, nor boundaries as hardness. They no longer pit compassion against protection, nor openness against strength. Instead, they discover that these are not contradictions, but complements. True empathy is not boundless absorption, but luminous presence. True compassion is not self-erasure, but service without sacrifice. True vulnerability is not exposure to harm, but courage to remain authentic despite the risk. The empath becomes less a pendulum swinging between extremes and more a still point, a center that holds. And it is from this center that their gift ripens into service. Not the compulsive service of trying to fix everyone, not the martyrdom of bleeding for the unready, but the steady radiance of living authentically. They become, as Jung envisioned, torchbearers for collective evolution. Their presence shows that aliveness is possible, that authenticity need not be sacrificed, that sensitivity can coexist with strength. They are not saviors, they are reminders. Their very being whispers to the world, you too can feel again. You too can reclaim what you lost. You too can integrate what you buried. In this way, the empath's personal healing becomes a collective gift. But Jung warned that the path remains perilous. Even integrated empaths can be tempted into what he called light-dimming, shrinking back when their presence threatens others, hiding their truth to avoid conflict. The pressure to conform never disappears. The world, still steeped in numbness, will continue to mock, to dismiss, to resent. That is why integration is not a one-time event, but a continual practice. The empath must regularly ask, am I living from authenticity or from fear? Am I offering my gift freely, or am I suppressing it to survive? Each choice either nourishes the flame or smothers it. And the world, whether it knows it or not, depends on that flame. For when empaths hide, humanity stagnates. The collective loses its models of emotional aliveness. Children grow up seeing numbness as normal, masks as necessary, cynicism as wisdom. But when empaths shine, they disrupt this inheritance. They plant seeds of remembrance in the collective psyche. A tear witnessed, a truth spoken, a vulnerability honored. These moments ripple outward, quietly challenging the epidemic of emotional disconnection. Jung saw this ripple effect as essential to humanity's evolution. The empath who protects their authenticity does not just heal themselves, they help heal the collective soul. If you recognize yourself in these words, consider this: the resentment you've endured, the betrayals you've survived, the loneliness you've carried. None of it proves you are broken. It proves you are luminous. It proves you carry what others have abandoned. And while this burden is heavy, it is also sacred. You are not too much. You are precisely what this world has forgotten it needs. Your task is not to extinguish your sensitivity, nor to martyr it, but to integrate it, to let it become strength without losing tenderness, wisdom without losing wonder, fire without losing warmth. And when you do, you become more than an empath. You become a mirror of possibility for a world drowning in its shadow. You become evidence that authenticity can survive, even thrive, in a culture that mocks it. You become, in Jung's vision, a bridge between what humanity has lost and what it might one day reclaim. The question is not whether others will resent your light. They will. The question is whether you will guard it long enough for those who are ready to remember their own to find you. That is the real task. To hold the flame steady, even in the winds of projection, to keep it burning, not only for yourself, but for the ones still searching in the dark. At last, the journey comes to its deepest threshold, the place where the empath, having endured the cycles of projection and betrayal, stands face to face with their own inner truth. They no longer look outward for validation, nor inward with shame. They stand in a space Jung described as the integration of opposites, where the conscious and unconscious meet, where the shadow is not banished but embraced. For the empath, this means accepting that their gift is inseparable from their suffering, that their light will always cast a shadow in those who encounter it. To deny this is to fall into despair. To accept it is to be reborn. Rebirth does not come in a sudden blaze of triumph. It comes quietly, like dawn after a long night. The empath begins to notice they no longer collapse under every criticism. They no longer waste their fire convincing the numb to feel. They no longer mistake projection for truth. Instead, they respond differently. When accused of being too sensitive, they no longer shrink. They recognize it as an admission I cannot bear my own sensitivity. When mocked for being too trusting, they see it for what it is I cannot forgive myself for how I was betrayed. When told to toughen up, they hear the echo of a heart that once hardened to survive. In each attack, they hear not condemnation, but confession. And in hearing it this way, they remain steady, luminous, unbroken. This steadiness marks the culmination of individuation for the empath. They are no longer tossed between extremes of openness and collapse, giving and depletion, love and resentment. They have become what Jung called whole, not perfect, not unhurt, but undivided. Their shadow is not denied, but integrated. They know the danger of their gift, and yet they choose it. They know the cost of their sensitivity, and yet they embody it. They no longer dream of escaping their nature. They live it, fiercely and tenderly, without apology. This is what Jung meant when he said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." For the empath, this acceptance is both terror and liberation. From this wholeness flows a new kind of service-luminous compassion. It is not the naive compassion of trying to save everyone, nor the desperate compassion of seeking worth through sacrifice. It is the steady compassion of one who knows that resentment is born of pain, not malice. They shine their light fully, knowing some will flee from it, some will despise it, but some will be warmed enough to remember their own. And for those few, the empath's presence becomes a catalyst, not by force, not by persuasion, but simply by being. Their authenticity becomes medicine, not because they try to heal, but because they refuse to abandon their own wholeness. This is the empath's true destiny, as Jung saw it, to stand as living proof that sensitivity can survive, that emotional aliveness can endure, that authenticity can exist in a world of masks. They are not saviors. They are not martyrs. They are mirrors and beacons, keepers of the flame that others may use to ignite their own. Their life whispers to the collective psyche, "It is possible to feel again. It is possible to be whole again. It is possible to reclaim what was lost." And though their path is lonely, it is also luminous, for it carries within it the hope of humanity's evolution. The dangers do not vanish. There will always be those who project, those who resent, those who punish. The empath will always walk among shadows, but with integration, they no longer confuse the shadows of others with their own. They carry their light with discernment, offering it where it can be received, shielding it where it will be attacked. They no longer dim it to survive. They no longer extinguish it to belong. They guard it as sacred, knowing it is not theirs alone, but a gift entrusted to them for the sake of the whole. And so the question remains, not only for the empath, but for all who hear these words, will you protect your authenticity, even when others cannot bear it? Will you hold your sensitivity as sacred? Even when the world mocks it, will you dare to feel in a culture that numbs? For Jung's discovery was not only about empaths, it was about humanity. The resentment directed at sensitivity is not only personal, it is collective grief over our lost emotional truth. To reclaim that truth requires courage, the courage to face the shadow, to integrate what was abandoned, to choose aliveness over survival. And in this, the empath is not only wounded, they are guide. If you recognize yourself in this journey, know this: your suffering has always carried meaning. You were never too much. The world has simply been too little. You are not broken. Others are broken off from their own hearts. You are not naive. You are living what others have forgotten. Your task is not to convince them, nor to heal them, but to remain yourself. For in doing so, you become the mirror of what is possible, the bridge between what humanity has been and what it might yet become. You are not here to extinguish your flame. You are here to keep it burning, steadily, fiercely, tenderly, until those lost in the dark are ready to remember their own light. That is Jung's most profound discovery, that those who resent your authenticity are mourning their own abandoned truth, that their hostility is grief disguised as anger, that your gift is not too much for the world, but exactly what it needs to evolve. The choice, then, is not whether others will accept you. It is whether you will accept yourself completely. For once you do, you cease to be merely an empath. You become a symbol of what it means to be fully human,